The sun beat down on the parched grass of the Galilean hillside, yet nobody moved to seek shade. Thousands sat in a dense, shifting sea of humanity, their attention anchored to the center of the slope. The wind died down, and with it, the distant chatter of the village below ceased entirely. A heavy, expectant silence settled over the terrain, thick enough to feel. Every person present leaned forward, eyes fixed on the man sitting at the center of the gathering. Jesus rested his hands on his knees, his breathing slow and measured. The crowd mirrored his stillness. There was no movement, no coughing, no shuffling of feet. The only sound was the distant call of a hawk circling high above the valley, its cry piercing the absolute quiet. Then, a shift occurred in the front rows. A man stepped forward, breaking the perfect symmetry of the seated assembly. He planted his feet in the dry earth, cleared his throat, and directed his focus toward the center. The collective gaze of the crowd sharpened. Air vibrated, a tense shift from teacher to challenger. He strode, a measured pace, toward the hill's heart. He did not look at the people he passed. His eyes remained locked on the man sitting before him. He reached the edge of the clearing and stopped. He planted his feet firmly into the dust, creating a small cloud that drifted away on the dry breeze. Slowly, he crossed his arms over his chest, pulling his shoulders back to create a rigid, impenetrable frame. It was a posture designed to signal dominance, a physical barrier erected against the man sitting on the grass. He shifted his weight, testing the ground, his jaw set in a line of calculated skepticism. The crowd seemed to recoil slightly. A void bloomed, all eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. The scholar lowered his head, peering out from beneath his brow, waiting for the precise moment to break the silence. The air between them tightened, charged with the intent of a man looking for a flaw. He stood perfectly still, a statue of challenge carved against the backdrop of the valley, waiting for his opening. The silence broke. The scholar's voice was sharp, cutting through the heavy air like a blade. "Teacher," he called out, his tone ringing with the practiced precision of a man who had debated in every courtyard in the city. He did not lower his arms. He kept his stance rigid, his gaze demanding. "The law commands I love my neighbor," he continued, his voice rising just enough for the outer edges of the crowd to hear. "Yet, tell me, who exactly qualifies as my neighbor?" A murmur rippled through the thousands gathered on the slope. It was a question aimed at narrowing the scope of duty, a line drawn in the dust to limit compassion. The scholar waited, his chin tilted up, watching for a stumble, a hesitation, or an error in judgment. He stared, unblinking, unmoving. He leaned. Eyes met steady gaze, open, and entirely devoid of defense. The tension held, vibrating between them, as the crowd watched the two men. Jesus held the space, his stillness an answer before he even spoke a word. Jesus did not recite a rule. He did not point to the scrolls. He began a story, his voice dropping into a register that drew the crowd closer. A man traveled the steep, winding road from Jerusalem to Jericho. He began. The mental image took hold of the hillside. The path was narrow, carved into the side of the limestone cliffs. It was a route known for its isolation, where the sounds of the city faded into the dry rustle of wind through scrub brush. The traveler walked alone. He carried only what he needed for the trek, his boots crunching rhythmically against the loose shale. He moved at a steady pace, his eyes scanning the horizon, aware that the distance ahead was vast and unforgiving. There were no companions in sight, no caravan guards, and no fellow wayfarers to share the burden of the heat. Every step took him further from the security of the city walls and deeper into the wilderness. The sun beat down on the exposed track, turning the dust into a fine, choking powder. He checked his path, adjusted his grip on his pack, and pressed forward into the silence of the canyon entrance. He was entirely on his own, a solitary figure navigating the long, treacherous descent. The road narrowed as it dove toward the canyon floor. The expansive horizon of the plateau vanished, replaced by sheer walls of jagged limestone that seemed to lean inward. The traveler stepped off the sun-baked path and into the sudden, biting chill of the gorge. Here, the light no longer reached the ground. The sun was trapped above the rim, and the path ahead was swallowed by long, creeping fingers of gray shadow. The sounds of the world changed. The wind, once a constant companion. Wind howled, a mournful hum. Stone pressed, silence heavy. He paused. He looked back, but the way he had come was already obscured by the sharp turn of the canyon wall. He was no longer walking on a road. He was navigating a trap. He shifted his weight, his boots sliding slightly on the loose, uneven gravel of the canyon floor. There was no movement ahead, only the deepening gloom and the smell of damp earth and stale, trapped air. He pressed on, his pace slowing as the terrain grew increasingly treacherous, unaware that the darkness was holding its breath. Canyon's final turn, a narrow, rocky passage, casting long, irregular shapes across the path. The traveler moved past the first cluster, eyes locked on the ground, silence shattered as figures burst forth, moving with calculated, jarring speed. There was no time for defense. The first blow struck the traveler from the side, a heavy impact that knocked the breath from his chest and sent him spiraling into the dirt. Before he could regain his senses, a second assailant was upon him, pinning him to the ground with crushing weight. The air filled with the sound of scuffling boots and the sharp metallic rasp of blades being drawn. They moved with practiced efficiency, tearing away his pack and pulling at the fastenings of his gear. His pockets were emptied, their contents scattered into the dust. Every motion was precise and aggressive. He tried to scramble away, but a boot pressed firmly into his shoulder, forcing him back into the grit. In the span of a few heartbeats, the rhythm of his journey was replaced by the chaotic scramble of the ambush, leaving him pinned and helpless beneath the looming shadows of the canyon walls. The heavy footsteps retreated, the sound of them dying away against the canyon walls as quickly as they had arrived. The dust kicked up by the struggle hung suspended in the stagnant air, slowly settling back onto the ground. The traveler lay face down, the grit of the canyon floor pressing into his skin. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps that sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden void. He tried to shift his arm, but a sharp, blinding pain flared through his side, forcing him to freeze. He remained still, his cheek pressed against the cold, hard earth. The silence of the gorge returned, heavier than before, suffocating and absolute. Fingers dug dirt. Muscles refused. His body felt disconnected, a heavy weight pinned to the stones. He rolled his head slightly to the side, vision blurred, shadows deepened, path still, canyon indifferent. Alone, chilled, he lay still, pulse fading. The path ahead was empty, and the world had narrowed down to the small, jagged patch of dust beneath his eyes. The traveler's vision flickered, his consciousness tethered to the rhythmic thrum of his own pulse. Time lost its meaning in the canyon. Seconds stretched into heavy, agonizing intervals of stillness. He stared at a single pebble, watching an ant navigate the jagged terrain, when a new sound cut through the silence. It was distinct, deliberate, and steady. Footsteps, rhythmic, measured strikes against the stone floor of the path. The traveler forced his eyes to track toward the sound, his breath catching in his throat. A figure emerged from the bend, walking with a steady, unhurried gait. The light caught the fabric of his presence, radiating a brilliant intensity that seemed to pierce the deepening gloom of the canyon. The traveler's heart hammered against his ribs. He tried to speak, but the words died in a dry, rasping throat. He lifted a hand, just a tremor of movement, signaling his presence to the newcomer. The figure drew closer, his silhouette growing larger against the backdrop of the canyon walls. Hope, sharp and sudden, bloomed in the traveler's chest. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer alone. The ordeal was coming to an end. He watched, eyes wide and fixed, as the figure reached the edge of the clearing, stopping just feet away. The traveler's outstretched hand trembled, a silent plea hanging in the thin air. He waited for the figure to stop, to kneel, to offer the help that felt so close. Instead, the figure halted abruptly. The man on the path looked down, his gaze sweeping over the bloodied body and the jagged rocks. For a heartbeat, the silence held them both. He drew in, sealing himself. He did not speak. He did not offer a hand. With a quick, sharp twist of his shoulders, he stepped away, placing the entire width of the path between himself and the suffering man. His pace quickened instantly. The steady, measured thud of his boots against the stone turned into a rapid, retreating rhythm. The traveler watched the figure grow smaller with every stride, his hope dissolving into the canyon dust. The distance between them widened, turning the potential savior into nothing more than a retreating silhouette. The traveler's hand fell back into the dirt, his fingers curling against the unyielding ground. The sound of the retreating footsteps echoed off the canyon walls, fading into the distance and leaving behind a silence far colder and more absolute than before. The canyon regained its hollow stillness. The echo of the previous footsteps died against the red rock, leaving the traveler in a silence so thick it felt heavy on his lungs. He lay motionless, staring at the dust motes dancing in the dying light, his vision blurred at the edges, the world narrowing to the sharp pain in his side and the grit pressing into his cheek. He had almost accepted the end when the rhythm of the path changed again. A new sound scraped against the stone. It was not the fast, retreating stride of before, but a slower, more deliberate approach. The traveler squeezed his eyes shut, then forced them open. A new figure emerged from the shadow of the canyon bend. This one walked with a heavy, rhythmic cadence, his hands occupied by a cluster of thick, rolled parchments. He stopped. The sound of his sandals ceased abruptly. He looked down, his head tilting as he caught sight of the body slumped in the dust. The traveler did not move, his entire existence distilled into a single, agonizing question. The newcomer stood still, his shadow stretching long across the path, his gaze lingering on the bloodied ground. The air seemed to freeze as the Levite held his position, evaluating the scene before him. The Levite's grip tightened around his scrolls, his knuckles turning pale. He stared at the man in the dirt for a long, suffocating moment. Then, his jaw set. He shook his head once, a sharp, decisive motion that severed the connection between them. He did not ask a question. He did not reach out to check for a pulse. Instead, he pivoted on his heel, his sandals grinding against the loose gravel. He began to walk, his stride purposeful and fast, moving away from the body without a backward glance. The traveler watched his back recede, the last thread of expectation snapping as the figure disappeared around the bend. Above the canyon, the sun began its final descent. It bled across the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows that stretched like claws over the path. The sky shifted from a harsh, blinding glare to a deep, bruised violet and gold. The heat that had sustained the afternoon vanished, replaced by the biting chill of the desert night. The traveler lay alone in the deepening gloom, the dust settling over him in the cooling air. The world grew silent, save for the wind whistling through the rocks, and the last flicker of hope died out as the light failed completely. The canyon was a tomb of shadows. The wind rattled the loose stones, the only movement in the vast, darkening expanse. Then, through the rhythmic whistle of the breeze, a new sound surfaced. It was steady, percussive, and alien to the stillness. Clip-clop, clip-clop. The sound of hooves hitting hard-packed earth. The traveler pressed his face into the dirt, his heart hammering against his ribs, fearing the return of the bandits or another cold passerby. The rhythm grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls until it reached the bend. A silhouette emerged, low and broad, moving with a lumbering, deliberate gait. A donkey stepped into the dim light. Its rider sat tall, shifting his weight as he scanned the path. Breath hitched, feared kin rode. The hatred between their bloodlines was a wall of iron. The rider pulled the reins, slowing the beast to a halt. The donkey snorted, its breath visible in the cooling air. The rider leaned forward, his gaze cutting through the gloom. Dust settled on the broken man. Enmity hung heavy. The rider did not look away. He did not tighten his grip on the reins to spur the donkey onward, nor did he offer a word of dismissal. The traveler braced himself for an insult, for a spray of dust, for the sound of hooves retreating into the night. It never came. The rider shifted his weight, the leather of the saddle creaking loudly in the still canyon air. He reached down, his fingers finding the stirrup, and drew his foot back. With a slow, deliberate movement, he swung his leg over the donkey's flank. His boots hit the ground with a heavy thud, kicking up a small cloud of grit that caught the fading light. He did not pause to check the horizon or look for witnesses. He simply stood there, his back to the path, facing the man in the dirt. He took one step, then another, the sound of his boots rhythmic and steady against the rocky floor. He lowered himself, his knees hitting the hard earth with a sharp, final sound. He was no longer a stranger on a beast. He was a presence in the dust, kneeling in the same broken space as the victim, ignoring every law that demanded he keep his distance. The stranger reached into his pack, his movements unhurried and precise. He withdrew a small, rounded clay jar, the surface cool and smooth beneath his calloused fingers. He pulled the stopper, and a sharp, herbal scent cut through the metallic smell of stale blood and dust. He did not ask permission. He did not speak. He leaned over the broken man, his shadow shielding the traveler from the fading evening light. With steady, fingers dipped in amber oil, he pressed. Jagged lacerations along the man's side. The traveler gasped, his body jolting from the initial contact, but the stranger held his position, his touch firm and unwavering. As the oil seeped into the raw, exposed skin, the searing heat of the wounds began to dull. A strange, cooling sensation spread outward, replacing the sharp throb of the injury with a dull, manageable ache. The stranger continued the rhythm, moving from one wound to the next, his hands moving with a fluid, methodical grace that defied the chaos of the scene. The traveler let his head fall back against the stones, his breathing slowing for the first time since the attack. The warmth of the oil felt like a reprieve, a quiet defiance against the harshness of the canyon floor. Oil settled on raw flesh. He reached again, pulling out a length of fine, clean linen. The fabric was stark, brilliant white against the grime of the canyon floor. He shook it out, the soft rustle of the cloth audible in the quiet air. With a gentle touch, he wrapped linen, tight and warm, over his wounds, his fingers working with a steady, calculated tension that secured the dressing firmly in place. He smoothed the edges, ensuring no grit remained trapped against the skin. Each turn of the bandage was deliberate, a quiet act of restoration that shielded the victim from the biting evening wind. The traveler watched. White linen hid dark stains, a veil on his broken form. Dusty road, firm knot tied. Palm-pressed bandage, secure fit. A silent contrast to the brutality that had left the man abandoned only moments before. With the final wrap in place, Linen's soft touch eased pain's sharp sting. Task lingered. Stiff legs stirred. Stranger neared waiting beast. He pulled on the bridle, guiding the beast closer until it stood directly over the wounded man. The weight was immense, a dead, unyielding mass that resisted every effort. The stranger grunted, his muscles straining as he hauled the victim upright, shifting his own weight to counter the imbalance. He maneuvered the traveler's arm over the animal's back, locking his hands together to hold the man steady against the side. It was a slow, agonizing process of small adjustments and firm holds. Finally, he gave a sharp heave, and the traveler slumped across the back of the beast. The stranger breathed hard, his chest heaving, but he did not stop. He adjusted the positioning, tightening the straps to ensure the man would not slip. He reached for the lead rope, took a deep breath, and began to walk. The donkey moved forward with a measured, heavy gait. The crunch of hooves on stone and the rhythmic sway of the body became the only sound in the canyon. They moved away from the site of the attack, leaving the silence behind, heading toward the faint glimmer of the path ahead. The sky deepened into a bruised purple, then black. The road beneath them turned from dusty path to jagged, uneven stone. The Samaritan walked with a heavy, rhythmic limp, his muscles burning from the hours of supporting the extra weight. Beside him, the traveler had gone quiet, his head lolling against the animal's neck. Each time the beast stumbled on the uneven ground, the Samaritan had to lunge forward, catching the man before he could slide off into the dark. It was a constant, precarious dance of balance and exhaustion. The cold of the night began to seep into the canyon, turning the air brittle and sharp. Just as the Samaritan felt his own strength failing, a dull glow appeared against the gloom ahead. It was a flickering torch, mounted beside a heavy timber-frame door. He quickened his pace, the sound of their arrival echoing against the stone walls of the canyon. The inn stood as a solitary island of light in the vast, empty landscape. He pulled the animal to a halt, the sudden stillness of the air feeling heavy. He reached out, his calloused palm finding the rough surface of the door, and pushed. The wood groaned, swinging open to reveal the warm, dim interior. They had crossed the threshold from the wilderness into the reach of safety. The long, brutal journey finally brought to a pause at the edge of the sanctuary. Innkeeper's gaze swept the scene. He frowned, his gaze lingering on the blood-soaked linen and the ragged state of the traveler. He made no move to assist, his hands remaining buried in the folds of his workspace. The Samaritan did not wait for an invitation. He stepped forward, the floorboards creaking under his weight, and reached into his satchel. He pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. With a steady, deliberate motion, he poured silver coins into his open palm. The metal clinked sharply in the quiet room, the sound echoing off the low rafters. He extended his hand, forcing the innkeeper to look away from the victim and focus on the payment. The innkeeper stared at the gleaming surface of the coins, his hesitation breaking under the reality of the offer. He reached out, his fingers closing around the silver as the Samaritan pressed them firmly into his grasp. The transaction was absolute. The weight of the coin transferred from one hand to the other, marking the end of the Samaritan's immediate burden and the beginning of the innkeeper's duty. The Samaritan stood back, his chest rising and falling with the exertion of the long trek, watching as the innkeeper finally turned toward the man to begin his work. The Samaritan moved toward the door, his shadow stretching long across the floorboards. He stopped, his hand resting on the latch, and looked back at the bed where the traveler lay. The man's breathing was shallow, his face marked by the trauma of the road. The Samaritan walked back to the bedside, leaning over to inspect the tension of the bandages one final time. Satisfied, he turned to the innkeeper, who stood waiting by the hearth. The Samaritan spoke, his voice low and firm. "Take care of him," he directed, his gaze locking onto the innkeeper's face. He reached into his satchel again, though it was now nearly empty, and tapped the wood of the table to emphasize his point. "Whatever more you spend on his recovery, I will repay you when I return this way." The innkeeper nodded, the gravity of the pledge settling between them. The Samaritan did not linger for gratitude or recognition. He stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy door closing with a dull thud behind him. He looked down the dark, winding road, his posture steady and purposeful. The commitment was set. He had provided the initial means, but he had tied his own future resources to the survival of a stranger. He turned his back on the inn and began the long walk home, leaving the promise of his return hanging in the quiet night. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the hillside. Jesus sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the scholar. The man who had challenged him stood with his jaw tight, his hands gripped behind his back. Jesus spoke, his voice carrying clearly over the hushed crowd. "Of those three, who acted as a neighbor to the victim?" The scholar remained still for a long count, his eyes scanning the grass at his feet. He looked up, his posture finally breaking, the rigidity in his shoulders giving way. "The one who showed mercy," he replied. His voice was steady, but quiet. Jesus nodded once, acknowledging the truth of the response. He stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "Go and do the same," he instructed. He turned away, leaving the scholar standing alone in the center of the clearing. A profound stillness settled over the hillside. No one moved, no one spoke. The wind died down, and the air grew heavy with the weight of the command. The crowd watched, their focus entirely on the space between them and the path ahead. The lesson hung in the air, etched into the silence, demanding an answer that moved beyond words.